What is up, Pauper players? Welcome back to another Salt and Pauper Saturday video, but you've already seen the thumbnail, you've already read the title of the video, so you know what we're doing today. Let's jump right in to this tier list. Alrighty, guys, it's been a little while since we've done a meta tier list. We dropped one at the beginning of the year. Now it's closer to the end of the year, bordering on the end of October, and we are going to revisit the Pauper metagame, see what's changed, and see where the decks fall into line. So, first things first, we have 4-color gates. This is a deck that rose in popularity pretty briefly to combat burn and early mono red variants. And it was Naya splashing black for things like suffocating fumes. It ran Ceruli Gatekeepers as a 4-drop to gain a bunch of life. And then it ran, your standard Sacred Cat gate package beatdown. The deck had very limited removal, which was suited towards a format that had a lot of tokens and was going very wide. And wasn't trying to compete with that, but instead just focusing on out life gaining their damage. Overall, the deck has fallen off quite a bit, but with the recent rise in red deck popularity, I would expect decks like this to come back at least a little bit. We've seen that recently, a lot of people brewing with like black-green fogs and things of that nature. But unfortunately, with a huge gate package, this deck just doesn't have the speed to keep up with the meta today. Not sure if this deck could even steal a challenge at this point. Unfortunately, I think this is really just going to be relegated to the trash tier at the moment. Even I have retired this one out of my battle box. It's just not really what you need to do in this metagame. It's too slow. It doesn't have the removal you need. It doesn't have the interaction you need. And ultimately, it's just trying to do its own thing. And that thing is not as good as the thing every other deck is doing. Next up is Ultratron. This is a previous S tier deck, and I do think it is still very strong. It can certainly steal challenges, so we know it's at least mid tier. But this deck has not changed a lot since the last tier list. It's added Wizard's Rockets from Lord of the Rings. It's added Candy Trail from Wilds of Eldraine, but in terms of like legitimate improvements, I mean, it got Merkinsmith, and that's really the last meaningful addition to this deck. I think this deck is probably going to settle in the tier 1, tier 2 area. This deck is still, of course, very vulnerable to graveyard removal, but it can definitely take some 5-0s. I think this is probably going to end up on the lower end of tier 1. So we're going to start that here in our tier 1. Maybe we revisit that as we go along. Next up is Boggles. Boggles is a deck that has always been good enough, but never great. And in this current metagame, that's pretty true. It continues to have reasonable matchups against a lot of what the decks today want to do, especially against things like Mono Blue and Coggates and things of that nature. Really can put pressure on decks with tapped lands very quick, and it can definitely run over things like Cryptic Serpent and Tolarian Terror on its way. Where the deck really falls down is that its speed, like many others, is proving to just not be fast enough to deal with red. It is a decent matchup. If you curve out on this deck on the play, it's very difficult for the red deck to beat you. But I think at most this is another one of those low tier 1 decks, maybe tier 2 decks. I'm inclined to say this is high tier 2. I think that the deck is a solid contender, but not quite where you want to be. It's kind of where you need to be sometimes based on your local metagame. Next up is the Boros Initiative deck. This is a Snapbolt original and one of my personal favorite decks in the format. Unfortunately, it has definitely fallen out. Lots of tap lands, and ultimately it breaks down in its speed. Now, it does have things like Stonehorn Dignitary and Prismatic Strands, which are great, great cards in this metagame right now, especially against all of the combo intensive decks and decks relying on the combat step to kill you. This deck can be quite strong. Where it kind of falls down is that it doesn't have a ton of card selection, so unless you keep a hand with Prismatic Strands, you're not going to have much chance of drawing one before you need it, and that's a little bit of a problem with a deck this slow. Oftentimes, you're going to want to Cleansing Wildfire on turn 2, and that's just not going to get it done right now. So I think while this deck is still very capable of stealing a challenge, I think that it's probably in the low end of steal a challenge, to be honest. I mean, I love this deck, so it hurts me a little bit, but I think that's where it needs to be. Next up is Boros Synthesizer. This deck is certainly still powerful. It's got enough removal. The ability to have Cart Clan Shaman in the main board really does hose the Goblin Red decks. So I think this is definitely in the tier 1 or tier 2 areas. This may be at the top of tier 2. This is certainly below Altertron, I feel, just because it does have a little bit of closing trouble where it can stabilize and it can go very deep in card advantage, but it doesn't win the game very quickly. And because of that, you can give your opponents a lot of time to kind of assemble their game plan, and that's pretty big weakness these days. So I think this is going to end up the top of tier 2, actually. Or very close to the top of tier 2. Good deck. Not the best deck available, but still very, very powerful. Next up is Rakdos Madness. This deck is still capable of stealing a challenge. It is fast enough to compete with a lot of the metagame. Unfortunately, it's just very vulnerable to Hydroblast and Blue Elemental Blast, and since Mono Blue is so big right now, your flyers get contested. The life gain is super relevant against the red deck, though, so I think this is at least can steal a challenge. Maybe bottom of tier 2. The deck is still very good. It's certainly doing things powerful enough to keep up with a lot of the decks in the meta right now. I think what we're going to do, actually, is we're going to, unfortunately, move this Boros deck down to tier 3 and put Rakdos Madness in the can steal a challenge territory. I think this is probably where it deserves to be. Next up is Black-White Ephemerate, a deck that has largely fallen out, again, due to the speed of the format increasing. This, unfortunately, is down here with the Boros Initiative deck, where the deck seems powerful. It's doing really powerful things, but it's relying on 5-drops with no solid mana ramp, and that means that you're just not going to be keeping up with anything else. Now, is it better than Boros Initiative is a question. I don't think so. But I could see an argument for it. I think we're going to leave it like this. I think, unfortunately, it's going in the tier 3 category. I do like the Black-White Ephemerate deck, but it's just not good enough at the moment. Next up is Cawgates. Cawgates is a very powerful deck. It remains a very powerful deck. This is definitely in the tier 1 or S category for me. I think Cawgates is potentially the top of tier 1. This deck has consistently been very, very powerful. It has life gain, it has counter spells, it has prismatic strands, and I think those are very, very strong building blocks. Now, the deck can have some slow starts with tap lands, as I've kind of hinted at down in these lower categories. Tap lands and slow starts in general are very, very bad for you. But the ability to draw out of them, life gain out of them, have the prismatic strands with card selection, things like Brainstorm, to get it very quickly, even if it's not in your starting hand, definitely helps this deck stabilize and get the time to build its advantage very quickly. Those of you who've seen my deck tech on Caw-Blade, especially with the infinite life combo, you know that you can certainly go for it on turn 3 if the opponent isn't playing around it or isn't playing a removal heavy deck. definitely a strong contender. I think this is going to go probably at the top of tier 1 for now, beating out Ultratron. Ultratron, a great deck, but it is a little bit too vulnerable, where Kagates does fall down to Ponza pretty hard. So maybe that is a cost of Kagates. We'll leave it as is. I think Ultratron is still a bit better than Kagates when you look at its bad matchups versus its good matchups. Ultratron might be a good place to stay as a standard for tier 1. Next up is Cycle Storm. Cycle Storm, unfortunately, just does not have what it takes in this metagame. Can it steal a challenge? No, not really. It hasn't in quite a while. Is it tier 3? Is it still like one of these solid decks? Yeah, probably. I don't quite think it's anywhere near as bad as 4-color gates. I don't think it's as good as either of these, though. So if it is in tier 3, it's going to be at the bottom of tier 3. We'll put it right there for now. Hasn't gotten any meaningful upgrades. It's still relying a lot on Street Wraith and a couple things. Yeah, I think it's just penalized by being a little bit too slow. It wants usually 1, 2, sometimes even 3 turns of just like play a land, pass the turn, cycle a bunch of stuff. And that's just not gonna do it these days. It really needs to be about a turn faster to compete. So I think it's gonna end up down here. Apologies, I'm recording this kind of late at night. All right, Elves is up next. Now, Elves is an interesting deck because when anyone else plays it, it's down here. But when Tarmo plays it, it's up here. And I don't know how else to describe it. That person just has an absolute masterful understanding of how to play this deck into various metagames and has consistently trophied with it. I think for that reason, because it does still trophy at the moment, even just with one person championing it, it has to be at least steal a challenge. It's probably going to be at the top of steal a challenge. I feel like this is probably a pretty fair place to put it at the moment. I wouldn't consider it tier 1 or tier 2. I definitely wouldn't consider it in the meta, so I don't think it can be above a tier 2. But it's still capable of winning, so I think it has to be here. Next up is Esper Glitters. Now, this is a deck that I really liked. I love the Vault Scourge aspect of that deck and the ability to have solid removal spells, which the Azorius Affinity All That Glitters list starkly misses. Things like Suffocating Fumes are very, very powerful right now, especially against all the Goblin tokens that you're likely to play against. I think that this can probably steal a challenge still, somewhere in the Rakdos Madness range. It certainly wouldn't be in the meta, so I'm not going to be putting it above a tier 2, so this is probably its cap. I think that All That Glitters itself raises the power level of this deck pretty considerably above a tier 3. It's just such a good card. That if you're running 4 of it, you're likely to be at least can steal a challenge. I think this is probably above Rakdos Madness in terms of power level. Is it above Elves? I know that pronunciation is going to trigger a lot of people. Is it above Elves? And that's really the spot where I'm at here. I think this could go either way. I think just because Elves I've seen results for, regardless of how many people are playing it, I think Esper Glitters probably falls below it. Next up is Familiars, White-Blue Familiars. This is still a very powerful deck. It's pretty fast and a little bit resilient because it has a lot of blockers, as well as, you know, the 0-4s, 0-3s, that can kind of gunk up the board while it gains life, and that's really strong. This does definitely fall over to Ponza. I don't think it's in the tier 1 category at the moment. It's probably the top of tier 2. Now, it has gotten a little bit better since the last time, although the meta has shifted quite dramatically since last time. Meeting of Minds is quite a good addition for that deck. And I do think the deck has gotten better because of it, which is probably why it is keeping up as well as it is. I think this is definitely above Can Steal a Challenge. I think this is probably above Boggles, and it feels better than Synthesizer. So I think we're going to order them like that for now. Familiar is still a very, very good deck. It's just not competing with the top tier, I don't think. And next up is Flickertron. Now, Flickertron used to be an absolute staple of a deck. Unfortunately, now I think at best it's probably tier 3, but realistically it's probably down here. Flickertron just doesn't keep up with the format. It wants a lot of setup. It doesn't really have the win condition that something like the Altertron has. And it doesn't kind of lock down the game or win immediately like Altertron does. It just relies on incremental advantage over several turns, and that's just not good enough right now. Unfortunately, as much as I love this deck, I think it has to end up down here in the trash tier. It's just not holding it down like it used to. Maybe if we get a couple of meaningful either unbans or a couple good cards increasing the consistency of this deck or increasing the speed of this deck, maybe it feels a little bit better. But as it is, the mana requirements of Flickertron just feel subpar when faced with the option of Altertron. Unfortunate, but I think that's where it has to be. Next up is Food. Food is a deck that is fairly good. I have recently featured it. I've played it in paper. There's actually a paper sticker food gates list. It's just all the keywords that Walker had been toying with in paper, and I played it last week and did not great with it, but there are some learning pains, there's some growing pains, and it certainly felt like it had winnable matchups. I just got a little bit unlucky in pairings. Unfortunately, I don't think the deck is where it needs to be to like steal a challenge online. It is definitely suited more towards the paper metagame than it is the online metagame. So I'm not going to rate it as a paper deck. I'm going to rate it as an online deck. I think this falls down with like the value generators down here. It's probably better than these two value generators. So I think this is going to end up in like the top of tier 3, bottom of challenge tier kind of thing. This feels about right to me. Food is a cool deck. I really wish it was better than it is, but I understand why people don't want it to be better than it is. If it was too good, it would be very frustrating to play against because it's a very difficult engine to stop. But yeah, I think top of tier 3 is probably where this deserves to be. Next up is Golgari Gardens. This is still a very powerful deck. It's definitely in the Can Steal a Challenge tier. It may even be in the tier 2 tier. I think it's probably in this mid-range here. It's certainly better than these 3 decks, so I think at best it's top of Challenge tier, low tier 2. I'm going to set this down here for now. Golgari Gardens is a black splashing green control deck. It kind of filling the mono black control spot right now. And ultimately, I think that it is the better variant of mono black. It's splashing green pretty much for free blockers in Colony Gardens, which gives the name of the deck, as well as Avenging Hunter to start the initiative as a win condition, and it's been a fairly powerful deck. It's had a couple of pretty good showings recently, so it's still possible it can steal a challenge. I think because of the tools this deck has in the meta, it's got board wipes, it's got spot removal, it's got a little bit of life gain in things like Weather the Storm available to it from the sideboard. You can even run Unexpected Fangs if you want to run like in combination with your Crypt Rats, which can gain you a ton of life if they go wide. I think this is probably better than Synthesizer, but it's certainly not better than Familiars. So I think this is going to end up in tier 2, right about in the middle. Next is Grixis Affinity. This card is quite strong. This deck is quite strong still. It hasn't had as much of a showing as the Ninfinity or All That Glitters Affinity blue-white lists. But because of Red's popularity and its ability to slam main deck Krark Clan Shamans and have them active on turn, 1, um, deck is pretty good. Let's see where we want to put it. It's certainly top of tier 2. It's probably bottom of tier 1, if I'm honest. I think All That Glitters Affinity is a little bit better just because it has more all-in potential, and this is a slower, more grindy control game. This falls into line with that Cog8 strategy of just trying to deal with the threats that your opponent plays and then take over the game. And those reactive strategies have definitely proven to be less powerful than the proactive strategies in the meta these days. So Grixis Affinity probably going to end up at the bottom of tier 1. Still powerful. Krark Clan Shaman is a very powerful tool in this metagame, and it still has the ability to run things like Gearcrafter Serpent or Gurmag Angler, which do work very well against the mono blue deck. It still has Galv Blast, which deals with Delver very succinctly, and Blood Fountain gives it a recursional engine that mono blue just doesn't have access to, so you can bring those creatures back to back to back. And then if you ever land a Kenku Artificer, it's very difficult for mono blue to beat that unless they have very specific, like Echoing Truth or something like that. So, sorry, Echoing Truth doesn't get there, but Snap does. Yeah, I think Grixis Affinity probably bottom of tier 1 at the moment. Still a very strong deck. Affinity in general is a strong deck, but not quite as good as its other variant. Next up on the chopping block is Heroic. This is mono white Heroic. Unfortunately, I don't think this is in the Consteal a Challenge range at the moment. It's just not, it's just worse Boggles, to be honest. I think this is going to end up down here, probably in this territory. Maybe under food. It hasn't gotten any meaningful upgrades recently, and the deck really has just not kept up with the pace of the format. Now, it does have access to things like, Prismatic Strands, which is very powerful right now. It has ways to give lifelink with the enchantment, but ultimately, I think the deck just kind of falls behind in resources. It's very, very starting hand dependent. I don't think this is in the Consteal a Challenge Tour. I just don't see that happening. Too many things are well prepared for Boggles, and this gets hit by those cards. So this feels probably down here for me. Maybe right here. We're going to go right there in the middle of tier 3. I think that seems fair. And while the deck can perform, it's very difficult for this deck to kind of really outshine a lot of these decks above it. So I think that's where it's going to stay. Next up is Infect. Now, Infect is a very powerful deck that got a meaningful upgrade with Embiggen. Now, I don't think that this is like the new hotness or the next best deck like some other Pauper players do. I do think the deck has always been kind of in the top of tier 3 low Consteal a Challenge range. But it's been a long time since this deck has put up a result that is noteworthy, so I think at best it has to be low Consteal a Challenge. But even then, I think this is going to end up down here at maybe the top of trash tier. The deck just is not good right now. If some variants start popping up and prove that they are better, maybe we can revisit, and I will admit that I was wrong. But especially with the way that people are competing with mono red with these fog variants, and like Infect is very, very weak to those already. So having them be more popular just really impacts the playability of this deck. Next up is Jeskai Glitter. Sorry, not Jeskai Wildfire. Jeskai Glitters. This is a deck that is, I think, just worse than Esper Glitters. And Esper Glitters we put in the Consteal a Challenge territory. I think for consistency reasons, just running Glitters is good enough to steal a challenge sometimes. Is it better than Rakdos Madness? Probably. This does good things, but probably less consistently. It is running more tapped lands than the other variants of Glitters, so I think this is probably going to be low can steal a challenge. That seems correct to me. Again, all that glitters, just a fantastic card. It's going to carry the deck in general. And when the draws line up, the deck is going to do well. There's not much you can do to avoid that. But I don't think the deck is consistent enough. I don't think that it has the same tools that Esper Glitters has, and it certainly lacks the kind of focused all-in potential that blue-white Affinity has. So it's going to stay down here, I think, in the low can steal a challenge. Jeskai Wildfires is up next. Now, Jeskai Wildfires is a deck that a lot of people still love. The deck is still good. It is putting up some results. It does allow you to be very reactive, but because it's so slow, it's hard to rate this deck above can steal a challenge. I think this is probably about where it caps out. I'm inclined to have this card probably at the top of tier 3. I think this makes the most sense. Wildfire as a general strategy has just not been that successful lately. And while the deck is still powerful, it's just not keeping up with what some of the other decks are doing. And it's been a long time since I've seen Jeskai Wildfires top out a 5-0 or a challenge. So I think this is probably where it has to be overall. Hard to imagine this deck persistently stealing a challenge. So I don't want to put it in that, and it feels worse than all the cards we already have in Steal a Challenge. So I think it's unfortunately going to be relegated to this top spot in tier 3, which feels almost disrespectful. I played this deck a lot, and it is a good deck, but man, it's just not kept up with the speed of the format lately, and it doesn't have the same tools that some of the other white decks are running, like Life Gain or Prismatic Strands. So I just don't think it can stay in there. Next up is Jund Wildfires. This deck is right down here next to Flickertron. It's really fallen out of favor. I think it's probably under Infect. At least people are trying Infect still. Flickertron and Jund Wildfire and 4-color Gates are all kind of in this bottom tier. Not much to talk about here. Very little has been done with this deck. Lately, Jeskai Wildfire is just significantly better than Jund Wildfire, and nobody's really playing this anymore, preferring Ponza over Jund Wildfire. Hi guys, Editor Salt here. Hey, I just wanted to tell you you've made it halfway through the video, so if you're enjoying the content, it would mean a lot to me if you went down to the bottom and clicked the subscribe button. It really does help the channel, and if you want to help the channel grow in other ways, consider sharing this to another Pauper player that you know or another Magic player that's interested in Pauper so that they can help get started. Or you could drop a comment down below to help support the channel and boost this to other people. So thank you so much. I'll let you get back to the tier list. Hope you're having a great Saturday. Bye. Next up is Kiln Fiend. Kiln Fiend is a red deck that kind of pops up now and then. It's really interesting, but very weak to targeted removal. Now, granted, as the format moves into a more proactive, do my thing faster than your thing strategy, and it moves towards destroying tokens with things like Suffocating Fumes, this deck is going to get better. However, as things move towards fogs, this deck is going to get notably worse. So I think this deck is probably somewhere in the can steal a challenge territory. I haven't seen it put up results in quite a while, though, so maybe it's down here with this Jeskai Wildfires list, where the deck is reasonable, but just not keeping up with the format. That seems ironic for a deck that's like all-inning on turn 3 most of the time. But unfortunately, I think it's just a little bit too weak right now. Could be bottom of Steal a Challenge. But I think it's largely fallen out of favor, so it's probably got to be down here. Let's put this with Wildfires. I think Wildfires is probably slightly better than Kiln Fiend objectively, so it's got to go up here. Next up is our first S tier. This is Koldatha Red. I mean, it's hard to to say that this deck isn't great. Red is very close to in a tier all on its own in this current metagame. I think Koldatha Red is still very, very good. I think it's probably tier 1, though, now that I think about it, comparing it to the other decks in the format. Koldatha Red is probably right up here somewhere. It's with this Ultratron list, maybe. Let's put you, like, right there, I think. And we're going to swap Coggates and Ultratron, I think. I think I want it like this. Coggate at the top of tier 1, and then Koldatha Red and Ultratron right behind it. That seems about right to me. Next up is Mardu Synthesizer. This deck still exists. I didn't know this deck still exists. This deck is definitely in the tier 3 low area with these decks that have largely fallen out. I think we're going to slam this right in the middle of tier 3. I mean, the deck just is not performing right now, and it's not keeping up. It runs a lot of tapped lands. It doesn't have the tools it needs, and it doesn't have enough pressure or life gain to really get out of it. So don't think that this deck can be above tier 3. Just kind of has to be relegated down here, unfortunately, based on its power level. Next up is Mono Black. Mono Black Devotion is not a good deck right now. If you want to play Mono Black, you're probably playing Gardens. This feels down here with like Jund Wildfire Flickertron, which is just a deck that just is not existing at the moment. We're going to put this right here. I think it's probably slightly better than Jund Wildfire and 4-color Gates. Just because it does have tools like Suffocating Fumes and Snuff Out and things like that to slow the game down a little bit. But man, is that deck just not a good deck at the moment. Next up is Mogwarts. Interesting deck, very strong deck, can certainly steal a challenge still. The deck has gotten recently a little bit more play. A lot of people testing it with like Troll and Exhume packages, which is super interesting. This deck is certainly can steal a challenge worthy, maybe even tier 2 worthy, but I'm going to try not to let my personal love for this deck influence that. So I think realistically it has to be in this can steal a challenge territory. I do think it's probably better than Elves at being proactive. So for that reason, it's probably slightly better. Yeah, I think Mogwarts is probably top of can steal a challenge. I don't think it's quite in the meta, so I'm not going to call it a tier 2 deck, but deck is very, very capable of winning games, so hard to turn that away. Next up is Blackburn. Blackburn is not a good deck right now. I'm tempted to put this in tier 3, but I think it might not even be tier 3 anymore. This seems right down here next to like Mono Blackburn. It's certainly not as good as Rakdos Madness by any means, so let's put you down here with Mono Black. I just think this deck is not fast enough and it doesn't have the interaction that it needs to keep up. No meaningful results, no meaningful updates, just unfortunately getting a little bit gapped by the format at the moment. Mono Blue Fae. Now, this is a deck that has largely fallen out of favor for Mono Blue Delver or Mono Blue Terror, but deck is still fairly strong. Certainly possible it tops out a challenge, so it's definitely at least can steal a challenge, but is it tier 2? Definitely an interesting question. Would I call this a tier 2 deck? It's definitely not the best variant of blue, just like Koldatha Red is not the best version of red, but I think it still makes tier 2. Would I place it above Boggles? Probably not. I think the deck is very good, and if it has the ideal matchups, it can certainly like put a stranglehold on decks, but I think this is probably the bottom of tier 2 at the moment. Next up is Mono Green Stompy. There's not much to talk about. This is going to go right down here. This deck is dead. It hasn't even been good since before 4-color gates, so I think there's no shot this deck is solid at the moment, and it's just not strong enough. So I think unfortunately it has to be in here. Mono red 1-drops. This is another interesting deck. This is the more goblin heavy variant of red, running things like Blast Runner. I don't think it's better than, it might be better than Coggates. Is it better than regular Kuldotha red? Probably not. I think these two are probably interchangeable right here. But I think for consistency, do we want the newest variant to be first? I don't think the deck is better than standard Kuldotha Red. I think Kuldotha Red is a very, very powerful deck and is certainly up here. Mono Red 1-drops is probably a little bit lower than Kuldotha Red just because it loses some amount of consistency. Tough to say on that one. Mono Red in general is so powerful right now. I think this is probably low tier 1. Next up is Mono Uterror, our true first S tier deck. This deck is very, very powerful and very, very popular. Lots of people are running up to 6, sometimes 7 Elemental Blasts or Pyroblasts against blue, and it still isn't enough. The deck is very, very powerful. Certainly in contention for the best deck in Pauper, so it deserves to be up here. I mean, Cryptic Serpent, Delver, Tolarian Terror, Counterspell, very hard to deal with the pace that this deck can put out, as well as the control tempo element that this deck is capable of generating. That being said, there are games where this deck just absolutely fizzles out, and it does not draw what it needs, or it doesn't have the bomb that it needs, or you kill the Delver and they just don't have anything to follow it up with, and they have no pressure for several turns of setup. So the deck isn't, I think, the best deck in the format, but it is quite good. Realistically, the deck is very good. Let's see. Monstertron. Monstertron is next. This is Mono Green Tron, Stompytron. This is unfortunately a trash tier deck. But with all the red, is it good enough for tier 3 right now? I guess it could be. With all the red deck, I mean, David Royale just posted a video with this deck doing well because it beats red. I don't think it can steal a challenge, though, so it's probably high tier 3, if I'm being honest. The deck is gimmicky, but certainly, like, reasonable in the metagame right now. So I think we can put it right here pretty safely. Next up is Pingerburn. Pingerburn is an interesting deck. I don't think it's tier 1 though. I think it's a tier 2 deck. It's probably down here with like Boros Synth and Golgari Gardens. Maybe under Familiars. I mean, it is still a burn deck, and red is so good right now. This is using things like Firebrand Archer and Thermal Alchemist with all 8 of the impulses plus Synthesizer, so it's going really deep on cards, and then it just doubles down on burn with Monastery Swiftspear, Bolts, you know, Fire Blast, Lava Darts, things like that. It's a good deck, but it's not the best variant of red by far. And I think it's probably under Familiars in terms of like a combo-y deck. Because you really do need to assemble a couple of crucial 2-drops, and if they kill all your 2-drops, you're in a really bad spot. Now, again, this deck is getting slightly better because people are moving away from targeted removal towards board wipes. Things like Suffocating Fumes, Drown in Sorrows, Fiery Cannonades to deal with the boards that Goblins produces, or Sticker Goblin produces, but I think the deck is still pretty weak considering red has Lightning Bolt, and Lightning Bolts can kill this, so probably in the right place. Poison Storm. Poison Storm is an interesting deck. It's certainly capable of stealing a league, especially right now. This deck seems very akin to Elves, Mogwarts, things like that, where there's one or two people really championing this deck and driving the results that we see from it. I think it is quite good in this meta right now, because fogs in general are good in this meta right now. But is it better than Mogwarts? Probably. Realistically, I think it is better than Mogwarts. It's a little bit better equipped for what the metagame wants to do right now. So for that reason, I think it's here. Really hope we get an improvement for this deck. I think that it's like one or two cards away from being a really solid contender in the metagame, and that would shake things up quite a bit. So if we get an improvement for this deck out of like Ixalan somehow, don't know how it would happen, but if we got one, very, very strong contender to shake things up. Could be interesting. Next up is Groll Ponza. Groll Ponza is kind of the fun police right now, to be honest. A lot of the decks that could be beating Mono Red are beaten by this, and that makes it very difficult for them to play because of its popularity online. I think this is probably above Mono Red 1-drops and about even with Grixis Affinity. It has fallen out of favor a little bit right now just because of the speed of everything else and how little reliance on lands both Mono Red and Blue-White Affinity have. So strong showing for Grixis, for Groll Ponza. I think it's probably a tier 1 deck still. But it's far from the best tier 1 deck at the moment. I think it's certainly at the bottom of tier 1. It is competitive viable still, but there are lots of decks that are punishing it at the moment. Next up is Slivers. There's not much to talk about. That's going to be down here in the mono green Stompy tier. I mean, man, these guys need their own tier. Mono green Stompy and Slivers need their own tier. Speaking of needing your own tier, Sticker Red. Boom. Right up here at the top. There is nothing close to how good this deck is. I wish we could put like 4 or 5 blank tiles right here and just gap this, because that's about what I feel it deserves. This needs to be at least 3 decks below, maybe right about there. Yeah, very, very good. Sticker Red. Sticker Goblin is just an absolutely obscene card on MTGO, and it is quite good in paper. It's just not as good as on MTGO. So in both variants, this deck is the best deck at the moment. It's not close. You don't have to worry about it. Let's see. There's not a whole lot to say here. It's just the best deck. Play this deck. Play this deck until Sticker Goblin gets banned, and then we can move on to all playing Mono Blue Terror, I guess. All right. Next up is Teachings. This is right down here, even below Mono Green Stompy. I think the last time I saw this deck was before Mono Green Stompy fell off. So really just let's get out of the way here. Teachings is going right down here, I think, with Mono Green Stompy at the bottom of trash tier. Boop. Next up is Tribe Combo. Tribe Combo, an interesting deck. I think Tribe Combo, admittedly, is like better as inside-out combo at the bottom of Cleric Kagates as a sideboard option. I don't think this deck is good. I think it's been a long time since this deck is good. This deck is going right down here next to Teachings. Let's see. Next up is Tortured Existence, another deck that is just not keeping up with this format. This deck is unfortunately going to be relegated to the trash tier. It is down here with Slivers and Mono Green. It's just not a good deck. That is going to go right down there. Next up is Turbofog. Turbofog is an interesting deck because it is capable of stealing a challenge, especially against all of the aggro decks, and it is an absolutely incredible matchup into things like Boggles and things of that nature. However, it is not good against the other combo decks in the format, and it is certainly vulnerable to things like Red Elemental Blast and Pyroblast. So at best, I think this is bottom of Can Steal a Challenge. Probably realistically at the top of tier 3. This deck can be an absolute all-star if you pick it into the right field, but if you don't know what you're playing against, it is not a safe bet at the moment. I think things like the Black-Green Fog might be slightly better placed. Next up is Black-Green Fae. Black-green Fae is a deck that has not existed in quite a while, and I don't think is going to exist again. This deck is down here with the black-green teaching or black-blue teachings deck, and it really just is not where it needs to be at the moment. I mean, I'm literally in the way of the trash tier. There's too many decks in this category. You don't need to worry about it. It's not anything good, and it's gonna stay down there, I think. Next up is Blue-Black Terror. This deck is the variation of Mono-Blue Terror, except it gets to run Demur, and it gets to run Snuff Out with Gurmag Angler as a backup. This deck is still quite good. I think it's like tier 2, maybe bottom of tier 1. Getting Snuff Out is quite good in this metagame, but having extra tap lands is not good. Loses access to Delver, so you don't get a lot of the racy games, but man, Snuff Out, Unexpected Fangs, and Suffocating Fumes is a really powerful alternate package that the Mono Blue variant doesn't get. I think this is probably bottom of 1 tier. Yeah, we're gonna stick this at the bottom of tier 1, I think. Blue-green Ponza. Boy, oh boy, that's an old deck. This deck is not good. It's just not what it needs to be. It's probably down here with 4-color gates, maybe even after slivers. We're gonna put that right down here next to Mono Green Stompy. And let's see, what's next? Next up is Blue-Red Fae. This is a pretty good deck, actually. I think the deck is probably in the Mono Blue Fae area, maybe slightly better than Mono Blue Fae, because it has some level of interaction to deal with the Goblin, which is important right now. Is it better than Boggles? Probably not. I think that's probably about where it is. I think it is slightly better than Mono Blue Fae, but not much better than Mono Blue Fae. And it's also called Blue-Red Scred. And I think the deck is solid right now. Extra spot removal is good at the moment. As funny as that sounds, because you can kill the Sticker Goblin consistently, which does slow down the red deck quite a bit. You also have removal for the Monastery Swiftspear on turn 1 a lot, so not bad. It did get an upgrade with Lorien Revealed, similar to the Black-Blue Terror deck, so not too shabby. Next up is Blue-Red Terror with Scred. This is true, like, is it Terror running Scred? This is not a good deck anymore. Can it steal a challenge, really? Probably not. Probably not stealing any challenges, so is it even tier 3? I mean, Terror alone is a good card, right? So it's got to be at least tier 3. It's probably in this range. Let's put you, like, right there. Right under Turbo Fog. Deck is reasonable, but not good. Next up is You White Glitters. This is the other tier S deck in the format right now. This is probably the third best deck in the format at the moment. It is a very good deck, also called an Infinity or a Brute Squad. I don't think it keeps up with Sticker Red or Mono Blue Terror, but it is certainly a good deck and deserves its spot at the top, so happy to have it. Not much to say about the deck. It really just tries to go all in with Ornithopter, Gingerbrute, Frogmite, Myr Enforcer. Really just dumps its hand. It runs Of One Mind and Thoughtcast to refill. It's running a full 8 of those, 4 of each, and then it has All That Glitters as a finisher to kind of substitute Cranial Plating, so it feels a lot like the old aggro affinity deck, but it gets things like Turnicide and Metallic Rebuke as counterspells, which is super nice. But the deck is focusing almost entirely on being proactive. There's very little reaction, and if you get behind with that deck, it is very difficult to dig yourself out of a bad situation. So keep that in mind. Next up is Walls Cascade. Walls in general is like a reasonable combo deck at like the bottom of tier 2. Walls Cascade is not. Probably tier 3. Walls in general is pretty good, but it's not great. It's also vulnerable to things like Scark Clan Shaman and Fiery Cannonade, Sulfurous Vortex. Spot removal is very good against walls. But Pawns is not good against walls, so it does still have a little bit. Not sure about the Cascade version, though. I think the Cascade version is pretty bad. The regular walls deck would probably be... Regular walls would probably be right up here, bottom of tier 2, but Walls Cascade is going to be down here at like the tier 3 range, I think. Unfortunate, but that's what we get. Next up is actual Walls Combo. Walls Combo, like I said, bottom of tier 2, maybe better than Fae. It is a good combo deck, probably under Fae though. Bottom of tier 2, I think, is pretty good for that deck, and pretty good deck, to be honest. It's a little bit too weak to board wipes and things like Crypt Rats explosions, and targeted spot removal is pretty good against it. It does have a small weakness against Red Blast, which is definitely a weakness in this format, just because all of the pieces that allow it to go infinite are blue. So you can fight them on those, but otherwise, I mean, playing a lot of 0-4s right now is not bad. Playing a lot of, 1-2s, 0-3s, 0-4s in this format is not bad. It's a little bit slow. You can definitely blitz them out with a good red draw, but otherwise, the deck is pretty solid. And then last but not least, we have Mono White Weenie. Mono White Weenie can certainly do things. I mean, Prismatic Strands and Guardian's Pledge is definitely pretty good. It gets to run Soul Sisters, which is pretty good right now against the red, because you're basically taking 1 damage off of every token they have. Probably tier 3 though. Maybe bottom of Can Steal a Challenge. It's better than Heroic, I think. Yeah, Soul Sisters and Guardian's Pledge definitely does a lot for this deck, and you can go wide to compete with them. Prismatic Strands is strong. All right, we'll go bottom of Can Steal a Challenge. I think it's rare, but not as rare as Jeskai All That Glitters. Maybe it's slightly better than All That... No, it's not. Who am I kidding? All That Glitters is a way better card. Mono White Weenie, but that is it. And then we have, as a final edition, whatever I'm playing that week, the Salt and Pauper deck of the week, and that is the bottom of trash tier. So can't forget that. Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been my update for the end of 2023 and the Pauper metagame report. This is the decks I would suggest playing right up here in the S tier 1 and 2 category. So I would focus your efforts there. Find something that sounds fun to you, build it, and give it a try. Or you can watch several deck techs on lots of channels, including my own. So find a deck that sounds fun, watch somebody play it, decide if it's for you, and by all means, jump into Pauper. The best part of this format is that nothing on this list costs more than like 50 or 60 bucks to buy in paper, and much, much less than that to buy on MTGO most of the time, barring things with initiative cards if you don't have them already. But in general, guys, this is, I think, where the metagame is at. As many people have said, Sticker Goblin is very, very good and probably can't stay for very much longer. So play with it while you can. The deck is good and the card is incredible. And it feels very, very powerful. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you for spending your Saturday with me. As usual, guys, goodbye forever. Unless I see you next time. Peace out.